Today I want to talk about 5 reasons you may consider not having contact with your parents. Hang on. So not having contact with our parents is such a huge decision, right? I mean, they gave birth to us, they raised you. There's always a feeling of a bond there no matter what's happened because you came out of your mother's body. She gave birth to you. There's that connection there that never really truly goes away. So we need to acknowledge that the pull is going to be very strong. However, if you're suffering in your life as an adult because of contact with your parents or parent, then you may have either stopped contact or perhaps you're considering it. Well, sometimes it's the healthiest thing to do, depending on how you were raised. But it's confusing because somebody can say, I don't see him that much anyhow. What's wrong with showing up once a year for Christmas or for a birthday party? So these are the kind of negotiations a person does with themselves. This is normal. Detaching from them is an emotional feeling, an emotional concept, as opposed to something we do really physically. You can move 3,000 miles away, but if you feel still very attached to your mom and dad, then you're still really there. They're part of you, they're in you, and they may still be controlling you. Maybe you're considering this because they still push your buttons, and maybe you've tried having healthy boundaries with them, and it just falls apart when you're all together. And perhaps then you feel very attacked or used or emotionally mistreated. And perhaps they've taken no responsibility for the fact that they sexually, physically, mentally, emotionally, verbally abused you growing up. So the main thing to think about is, do you still feel like you're a little child trying to grow up and that it's being thwarted when you're around your parents? You're constantly being triggered around them, that after seeing them or interacting with them, perhaps you go into a deep depression, or even worse, maybe wanting to self-harm or being drawn to some sort of addictive substance, or lashing out at your own spouse or your own children or your own friends because of the interactions with your parents. And if this seems to be a consistent ongoing pattern in your life, and you've had some therapy to look at it honestly and openly, and you still can't get past it, that's when one can begin to consider maybe it's time to give up all contact. The good news is we can choose our family in life. We can choose to be around people who respect us and love us for who we are unconditionally versus people we just got our DNA from. And even though blood and DNA are very important, and people think of it as being very binding, it's really not. You can either choose to have it be binding or you can choose to not have it be binding. It's up to you. So cutting off is most important if you were raised in an abusive situation and you're still feeling abused as an adult. Even though you're all grown up and you're in your 30s or 40s or something, the underlying emotional issues are still there. Maybe you've never worked on them, and that's why you're so sucked in still. In a minute, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why it may be acceptable to lose all contact with your parents. But the main thing first is that you do some emotional work on yourself with a therapist. It's important if you're going to make this big of a step in your life that you understand yourself well and you understand the whys about why you're considering this. Because if it's something just about unresolved anger, for example, a couple things happened back when you were a teenager and it was just never talked about, maybe that can be worked through. Maybe it's just time to have a sit down and process that with your parents. So you have to look at all angles before you completely cut off contact. Is it you avoiding dealing with the situation that could be somewhat remedied fairly easily? Or have you tried that and to no avail, it just hasn't worked and your parents aren't hearing you at all? That's a totally different situation there. It's important that you understand how you have dealt with the abusive environment and how that's impacted you and how it still affects your life. That work needs to happen no matter what. Because even if you lose contact with your parents, you still may be perpetrating what's familiar with other people in your life, other loved ones. You're doing what was done to you, and that may not stop because it's familiar, and so it'll continue unless you get in touch with yourself and understand how you're reacting to life and to other people and so on. So number 1, some children of addicted parents feel the need to cut off all contact. They don't want to enable their parent in any way, and because of the addiction that their parent or parents are caught in, they're not feeling like anything can be resolved if they were raised in an abusive household with that parent. Number 2, do they still try to guilt you or somehow manipulate you? Or they're passive aggressive, or they play the victim and blame you for things? If they're doing any of what I've just said, and you've suffered childhood trauma at their hands and they are still doing that as adults, that's a legitimate reason to consider walking away. Number 3, do they completely ignore your feelings and your needs? For example, maybe they're around your children from time to time and they're still implementing that old destructive behavior that they used on you. They're now trying to do that with your own children, and you're not going to stand for it. And you've tried to talk to them about it, and you've tried to set up healthy boundaries, but they ignore you and act like you've never said anything. Well, that's another reason to consider losing contact. Number 4 is, do they try to control you? They're always in controlling mood with you. That's another good reason. And number 5 is, they're repeating any kind of behavior whatsoever that led you to be a victim of abuse, for example, growing up, and that still sneaks in from time to time when you're around them. So maybe you were physically abused, and every so often when you're around your father, you see him kind of go like, okay, if there's any kind of behavior like that. Or perhaps you were verbally abused by your mother growing up, and now sometimes as an adult, even though she's a little bit better, every so often she'll still say to you something like, you're stupid, you've never amounted to anything, look at what you're doing. But then apologizes immediately after that. So if any of the old abuse, if any of the old patterns, if any of the old behavior or intent is still there, and you've pointed it out, and they still continue to behave in whatever way they want to behave and say whatever they want to say, then that's a legitimate reason, in my opinion, to think about losing contact. So I hope this has been helpful somewhat. Having relationships with a toxic parent or parents is very hard to walk away from, because that's all we knew growing up, right? That was what was familiar. Through their eyes is how we saw the world. And now maybe you're in your 20s and 30s or 40s or whatever, and you're thinking about ending that, and that's going to bring up some grief and sadness, and you need to feel that grief and sadness. So be very aware of the feelings that are coming up for you if you decide to stop all contact with your parents, and know that that's normal, and process these feelings with a therapist. The main thing is that you're pointed in a new, healthier direction in your life. You're making it be more about you in a healthy narcissism kind of way, where you get to come first for once, and you're focused perhaps on your spouse and your kids or your friends, and you want to do that in an enjoyable, healthy way, and that's where your focus should and can go. And if that means you need to cut out some toxicity out of your life, then you may need to do that. Please subscribe to my mental health YouTube channel if you like these kind of videos. And until next week, this is Brad Shore signing off from Ask a Shrink.